Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which the spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. Scrooge felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. "I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come," said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed downward with its hand. "You are about to show me shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us," Scrooge pursued. "Is that so, spirit?" The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. "Ghost of the future," he exclaimed, "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear your company and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?" It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. "Lead on," said Scrooge. "The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit." The phantom moved away, and Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up, he thought, and carried him along. The city seemed to spring up about them and encompass them of its own act. There they were, in the heart of it, amongst the bankers, who hurried up and down and clinked their money in their pockets and conversed in groups and looked at their watches and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold scales and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of bank managers. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. "I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him?" asked a third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff box. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first, with a yawn. "What has he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman with a pendulous excrescence on the end of his nose that shook like the gills of a turkey. "I haven't heard," said the man with a large chin, yawning again. "He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know." This pleasantry was received with a general laugh. "It's likely to be a very cheap funeral," said the same speaker, "for upon my life I don't know of anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer." "I don't mind going if a lunch is provided," observed the gentleman with the excrescence on his nose. "But I must be fed if I am to make one." Another laugh. Scrooge, feeling assured that the conversation must have some hidden purpose, set himself to consider what it was likely to be. It could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob Marley, his old partner, for that was past, and this ghost's province was the future. But nothing doubting that there was some latent moral for his own improvement, he resolved to treasure up every word he heard, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared. For he had an expectation that the conduct of his future self would give him the clue he missed. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to Scrooge's usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. Quiet and dark, beside him stood the phantom with its outstretched hand. They went into an obscure part of the town where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized its situation and its bad repute. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half-naked, drunken, slipshod, ugly. Alleys and archways, like so many cesspools, disgorged their offences of smell and dirt and life upon the struggling streets, and whole quarters reeked with crime, with filth and misery. Far in this den of infamous resort, there was a low-browed, beetling shop where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were bought. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in, by a charcoal stove, was a grey-haired rascal nearly 70 years of age. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh.
The charwoman, the laundress, and the undertaker's man. You couldn't have met in a better place,
said old Joe, removing his pipe from his mouth.
Come into the parlour.
The parlour was the space behind the screen of rags. The old man raked the fire together with an old stair rod. While he did this, the charwoman threw her bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, looking with a bold defiance at the other two.
What odds then? What odds? Said the woman. Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did.
That's true indeed, said the laundress.
No man more so. Very well then, cried the first woman. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose?
No, indeed, said the others.
If he wanted to keep them after he was dead, the wicked old screw, pursued the woman, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying, gasping out his last there, alone, by himself. It's a judgment on him. I wish it was a little heavier judgment, replied the woman, and it should have been, you may depend upon it, if I could have laid hands on anything else. Open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it.
Joe went down on his knees and, having unfastened a great many knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff.
What do you call this, said Joe. Bed curtains? Ah, returned the woman, laughing and leaning forward on her crossed arms. Bed curtains! You don't mean to say you took them down, rings and all, with him lying there? Said Joe. Yes, I do, replied the woman. Why not? I certainly shan't hold my hand when I can get anything in by reaching it out for the sake of such a man as he was. Now don't drop oil upon the blankets now. His blankets? Asked Joe. Whose else's, do you think? Replied the woman. He isn't likely to take cold without them, I dare say.
Scrooge listened in horror as they sat grouped about their spoil in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp.
Spirit,
said Scrooge, shuddering from head to foot.
I see. The case of this unhappy man could be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this?
He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed. A bare, uncurtained bed on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay a something covered up, which, though it was dumb,
announced itself in awful language. Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in that room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare to think. If there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death, said Scrooge, quite agonized, show that person to me, spirit, I beseech you. The phantom spread its dark robe before him for a moment, like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight, where a mother and her children were. She was expecting someone, and with an anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down, started at every sound, looked out from the window, glanced at the clock. At length, the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was young. There was a remarkable expression in it now, a kind of serious delight, of which he felt ashamed and which he struggled to repress. Is it good, she said, or bad? Are we quite ruined? There is hope, my dear. If he relents, she said, amazed therein, is nothing is past hope if such a miracle has happened. He is past relenting, said her husband. He is dead. She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth. But she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness the next moment and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. To whom will our debt be transferred? I don't know, but it would be a bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts. And so it was a happier home for the man's death. The only emotion the ghost could show Scrooge connected with that event was one of pleasure. Let me see some tenderness connected with that death, implored Scrooge.
The ghost conducted him through several streets to Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner and sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them, read Peter. The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand up to her face. The colour hurts my eyes, she said. The colour? There were tears. Oh, poor tiny Tim. They're better now again, said Cratchit's wife. It makes them weep by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time. Past it, rather, Peter answered, shutting up his book. But I think he's walked a little slower than he used these last few evenings, Mother. They were very quiet again. At last she said, and in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once, I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed. And so have I, cried Peter, often. But he was very light to carry, she resumed, intent upon her work, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble. But there is your father at the door. She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob and his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, Father, don't be grieved." Bob looked at the work upon the table and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. "Sunday? You went today then, Robert?" said his wife. "Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday." "My little child," cried Bob. "My little child." He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still, and Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, whom he had scarcely seen but once, and who, meeting him in the street that day, inquired what had happened to distress him. "On which," said Bob, "for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you ever heard, I told him, 'I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit,' he said, 'and heartily sorry for your good wife. If I could be of service to you in any way,' he said, giving me his card, 'that's where I live. Pray come to me.' Now it wasn't," replied Bob, "for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, as much as for his kind way, but this was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us." "I'm sure he's a good soul," said Mrs. Cratchit. "You would be sure of it, my dear," returned Bob, "if you saw and spoke to him. I shouldn't be at all surprised, Mark, would I say, if he got Peter a better situation." "And then," cried one of the girls, "Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself." "It's just as likely as not," said Bob. "One of these days, though there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I am sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we, or this first parting that there was among us." "Never, Father," cried they all. "And I know," said Bob, "I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, and although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it." "No, never, Father," they all cried again. Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, his daughters kissed him, the two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. "Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God." "Spectre," said Scrooge, "something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. Tell me what man whom we saw lying dead." The ghosts of Christmas yet to come conveyed him, as before, into the resorts of businessmen and bankers, but showed him not himself. "These courts," cried Scrooge, "through which we hurry now is where my place of occupation is, and has been for a length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I shall be in days to come." Scrooge hastened to the window of his office and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same, and the figure in the chair was not himself. The spirit's hand was pointed elsewhere. The churchyard. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. Scrooge advanced towards it, trembling. "Before I drew nearer to that stone to which you point," said Scrooge, "answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they the shadows of things that may be only?" Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. "Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends to which, if persevered in, they must lead," said Scrooge. "But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me." The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge crept forward, trembling as he went, and following the finger, read upon the stone of the neglected name, the grave, his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. "Am I that man who lay upon the bed?" he cried upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again. "No, spirit, oh no, no!" The finger was still there. "Spirit," he cried, tight clutching at his robe, "hear me, I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been but for this intercourse." For the first time, the hand appeared to shake. "Good spirit," he pursued, as down upon the ground he fell before it, "your nature intercedes for me and pities me. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows of me by an altered life. The kind hand trembled. I will honour Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all year. I will live in the past, the present and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me that I may sponge away the writing on this stone. Holding up his hand in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, Scrooge saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost.
Yes. And the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in. I will live in the past, the present, and the future, Scrooge repeated as he scrambled out of bed. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven and the Christmas time be praised for this. I say it on my knees, oh Jacob, on my knees. He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. They are not torn down, cried Scrooge, folding one of his bed curtains in his arms. They are here. I am here. The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will. His hands were busy with his garments all this time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties to every kind of extravagance. I don't know what to do, said Scrooge, laughing and crying in the same breath. I'm as light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. Hello here. What? Hello. Oh. He had frisked into the sitting room and was now standing there, perfectly with it. There's the saucepan that the gruel was in, cried Scrooge, starting off again. There's the door by which the ghost of Jacob Marley entered. There's the corner where the ghost of Christmas present sat. It's all right. It's all true. It all happened. Really? For a man who'd been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh. A most illustrious laugh. The father of a long, long line of brilliant laughs. He was checked in his transports by the churches ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Clash, clang, hammer, ding, dong, bell, bill, bell, dong, ding, hammer, clang, clash. Oh, glorious, glorious. Running to the window, he opened it and put out his head. What's today? Cried Scrooge, calling downward to a boy in Sunday clothes, who perhaps had loitered in to look about him. Today? Replied the boy. Why, Christmas Day. It's Christmas Day, said Scrooge to himself. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. Hello, my fine fellow. Hello, returned the boy. Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one at the corner? Scrooge inquired. Oh, I should hope I did, said the little boy. An intelligent boy, cried Scrooge. A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one. What, the one as big as me? Returned the boy. It's hanging there now. Is it? Said Scrooge. Go and buy it, and tell them to bring it here, that I may give them the direction where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. He must have had a steady hand at a trigger who could have got a shot off half so fast. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's, whispered Scrooge, rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh. He shan't know who sends it. twice the size of Tiny Tim. The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did, somehow, and went downstairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man. As he stood there, waiting his arrival, the knocker caught his eye. "I shall love it, as long as I live," cried Scrooge, patting it with his hand. "Here's the turkey! Hello! What? How are you? Merry Christmas!" It was a turkey. It was a turkey. He never could have stood upon his legs, that bird. He would have snapped him off in a minute. "Why, it's impossible to carry that to Camden Town," said Scrooge. "You must have a cab." The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair again, and chuckled till he cried. He dressed himself, all in his best, and at last got out into the streets. And walking with his hands behind him, Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant that 3 or 4 good-humoured fellows said, "Good morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said, often afterwards, that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. He had not gone far when, coming on towards him, he beheld the portly gentleman who had walked into his counting-house the day before. "My dear sir," quickening the pace and taking the old gentleman by both his hands, "how do you do? A Merry Christmas to you, sir."
Mr. Scrooge?
"Yes," said Scrooge, "that is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness?" Here Scrooge whispered in his ear. "Lord bless me," cried the gentleman, as if his breath were quite taken away. "My dear Scrooge, are you serious?" "If you please," said Scrooge, "not a penny less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Will you do me that favour?" "My dear sir," said the other, shaking hands with him, "I don't know what to say to such munificence." "Don't say anything, please," retorted Scrooge. "Come and see me. Will you come and see me?" Scrooge went to St. Paul's Church. And then walked about the streets and watched the people hurrying to and fro, and patted children on the head, and questioned beggars, and looked down to the kitchens of houses and up to the windows. And in the afternoon he turned his steps towards his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. But he made a dash, did it. Scrooge sidled his face in, round the door. "Fred," said Scrooge. "Why, bless my soul," cried Fred. "Who's that?" "It is I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner." "Will you let me in, Fred? Let him in? It is a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. So did the plump sister when she came. So did everyone when they came. Wonderful party. Wonderful games. Wonderful unanimity. Wonderful happiness." But he was early at the office the next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could only be there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late. That was the thing he had set his heart upon. And he did it. Oh yes, he did. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1:15. No Bob. He was full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open. You might see him coming to the tank. Bob's hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen, as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. "Hello," growled Scrooge, in his accustomed voice, as near as he could fake it. "What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?"
It's only once a year, sir," pleaded Bob, appearing from the tank. "It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir."
"Now, I'll tell you what, my friend," said Scrooge. "I am not going to stand this sort of thing any longer. And therefore," he continued, leaping from his stool and giving Bob such a dig in the waistcoat that he staggered back into the tank again, "and therefore, I'm about to raise your salary." Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it and calling to the people in the court for help and a straitjacket. "A Merry Christmas, Bob," said Scrooge, with an earnestness that could not be mistaken. "A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavour to assist your struggling family. Make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit." Scrooge did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough, in the good old world. He had no further intercourse with spirits. And yet, sometimes at dusk, he did see in a doorway, or scuttling along the street, the yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish boy and girl, glaring up menacingly. "Man's children," had said the spirit. The boy's name was Ignorance, and the girl's Want. Beware of them both, had warned the spirit. But most of all, beware of this boy called Ignorance. For on his brow I see that written, which is doom. Scrooge remembered. And it was always said of Scrooge that he knew how to keep Christmas and the New Year well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us, and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us.